Good afternoon, everyone. All eyes on October 2024 as the Jovian, the gas giants, line up in this square formation that has not been seen since 79 AD. In my opinion, there's going to be magnetic coupling, Jupiter leading the charge. These four gas giants are going to interact magnetically, and as they do, they're going to create their own magnetic field, a torus in the outer quadrant of the solar system. Perhaps that's why part of Neptune's atmosphere already reversing. But then we have the sun pulling us from the other direction in its torus field. Electromagnetism sandwich with the Earth between these two fields. Perhaps it will pull and stretch the Earth in ellipsoid, causing a global liquefaction event, otherwise known as a mudflood. We see these mud volcanoes inactive around the planet or very minimally active. Mud emanating from the Earth in so many places, from Mongolia to Iceland. The volcanoes are ash, very fluffy, but what if this turned into a VEI-7 mud event? Across the planet, more common than not, half-buried structures, and you have to ask yourself, if it's not a volcano, then what's burying? Easter Island, the Central American ruins and lithographs definitely show earth flows into these temples. Pakistan, these mud volcanoes are everywhere. Imagine if this solidified into hard-caked earth and there weren't enough people around to clean it with machines as we have today. Well, you would just build right over that, and this is why in so many excavations, more common than not, they find floors completely buried beneath. Not only in Spain, but in Russia, and megaliths as well. India, uncovered, not abandoned. In a missing chapter of history, we're told that these ant-like figures constructed these massive halls across the entire planet, and that was just the way they built. But perhaps it's something else. And this celestial map of the universe is really magnetic north and south, and when these all congeal and point to one quadrant of our solar system, society resets. And with so many changes happening in our world at the moment, you have to really step back for a second and ask if there's something greater going on than everybody just suddenly wanting the world to be equal. Almost doesn't even make sense. The last 2,000 years, it was just fine the way it was. We wake up tomorrow and, everything needs to be changed, reset. Well, maybe there is a reset coming, and when we look at the stars, the heavens, the planets, which all the ancient cultures did, specifically the sun, we start to see something in a cycle again that hasn't been seen since 79 AD coming up in October of 2024, these gas giants lining up in their square. One quadrant of the solar system, and they're going to start interacting electromagnetically. Jupiter's going to be leading the charge on this because, well, it's the largest magnetic field, followed by Saturn, and then the other Jovians are going to mix right in there with Neptune and Uranus. In a simplistic fashion here, the interaction of the magnetic fields will couple into something like this instead of being an individual set of planets out there. These poles, directions of the poles in the equator are going to start to amplify. And if this is true, then you would start to look for signs out already in the outer solar system of something changing dramatically, because we are talking a dramatic shift. And Pluto's atmosphere collapses, 20x more dense now than it was 2 years prior. That was a little strange. That happened back in May. And as it collapsed, the carbon dioxide came straight out, and there's now ice fields across the planet where there weren't 2 years ago. And then just in December, Neptune reverses its atmospheric direction. That storm that used to travel west to east reversed and now is traveling east to west. Electromagnetically, you would expect these atmospheric changes. Now, what are the chances? Two planets are now extreme to the point of extinction level event. Just at the same time, these magnetic fields are starting to interact with each other, coming into this alignment from now through 2024. Uranus is the next place to look, because within 6 months, if it does have atmospheric anomalies, you know that this is absolutely in play, and our planet's not going to be too far behind, except about 3 years on the atmospheric changes, which would march right lockstep with the timelines on when these four will get into their square. Electromagnetically, these are going to start intertwining with each other, but since Jupiter has the heaviest magnetic field, it's going to start perturbating the others and causing changes. And just like you had with a kid with magnets, they're going to pull toward each other. That could explain these atmospheric shifts. And what those will do, this will have an effect where it's going to create its own torus magnetic field out there, as it's its own slight new magnetic field in the solar system that's generally there once every grand solar minimum on a 200 or 400 year iteration, depending, because these planets never really come to this perfect square configuration except once every 2,000 years. Otherwise, they're an offset rectangle, and it's not exactly a perfect square, but it seems that there is some interaction out there magnetically that affects the Earth as well. And then we have the sun, a big yellow thing over to the left over here, that also is going to have a massive magnetic pull, but heading into a grand solar minimum and electromagnetic changes on the sun, coupled with that new torus field, what we see out in the outer solar system, you just have to ask what is going to happen with our planet's magnetic field or the atmosphere itself. Because it's going to get tugged. And when I say tugged, obviously we're going to be a little bit closer to the sun, which has the greatest effect on us. But that second magnetic field out there is also going to be pulling on our Earth's crust. So when you look at it in a different way now, you can see these two magnetic fields, the sun and the gas giants. And what I think is going to happen in a repeat in history is an ellipsoid Earth. Amount of stretch unknown, but it is going to cause a global liquefaction event, otherwise known as a mudflood. People are trying to look for the causation. There's so many clues, so many leftover remnants of these actions of cracks and mud and water and earth and sand oozing from the Earth's crust and burying structures. This is the mechanics of the mudflood. You have the ellipsoid Earth with a second magnetic field, or you have what we know as the stable magnetic field with just the sun. It's a huge difference. And even if that moves just mere miles, it's going to have a massive effect in terms of landslides, which we've seen an enormous uptick in massive landslides. And what do you see here? You might say, well, it was a landslide that buried a building. But yes, if you leave that and you find it in 100 years, people would just cover right over that and make new entrances into those top floors. And it doesn't matter where you look, you keep seeing these events again and again and again. Sure, it was a tailing pond that something caused it to crack. Well, what caused it to crack? Was it bad engineering or what is it? But we can see the same result. And if these structures are needed, people are just going to cut right into the second or third floor and make that the entrance. But we see it more routinely than not. And it doesn't matter if it's in Europe, South America, North America, Asia. This is the norm. Anywhere from 2 to 3 to maybe 12 to 15 feet of something earthy, whether it be mud, sand, or a combination of, had buried it to the point it was too much work to dig it out. And you always hear in school, oh, civilizations built on top of each other. And we take that for fact, and we say, great, that was it. But as soon as you try to explain this, oh, no, it doesn't, it couldn't be. But wait, every history book that you've ever read and every school that you've ever attended said societies built on top of societies, especially as we've gone through these last few thousand years. But now when you show this evidence, they're like, no, it couldn't be. It doesn't work like that. And even out in Utah, you can see what had happened here with Salt Lake Temple, 14 feet deep. And you can see clearly that that was still part of the original construction on the foundation that was buried. And we're jumping over to Russia, doing the measurements out. This building still has a fair few feet that's been covered. And you start to see these windows that are half emerged. And Russia seemed to be heavily affected by some of these same events being buried in up to 10 to 12 feet of new earth being put on top. Would you dig that out at the time if there was a very limited population on the earth, less than 1 billion people at that time? I think we were right around 700 million when all these events occurred. Think about right now, we have the engines, we use gasoline-powered motors, and we have all these excavating equipment, and there's 8 billion people. But back in these days, there would have been less than 1 billion people, and you would have had to do it by hand. So they would have just left it and put a new layer, crack a few windows out, and make those your doors. And you see this over and over and over again. And while I was looking through Russia, this is a great image here of the Kremlin, but back in 1880. Now over to Spain, we see the same thing with these cathedrals. So when you find a lot of these older cathedrals, forts, megalithic buildings, there always seems to be another layer underneath that. And academia gives you the excuse that it was built as a basement, but they had all that fine work under there for stables and a different entrance, and they would just bury it and cover it up. Why would you not just leave it a flat surface if you were going to do that? because this mud is everywhere on the planet. Now, at today's scale, it's very tiny. People use it for mud baths, but the same mechanics can be scaled up here in Romania. Because the electromagnetic effects we're thinking about, this is a 2,000-year event here. So much has been destroyed in the last couple thousand years, especially after conflicts and conquests. What did you do? You burned everything from the prior and you started fresh and new. Perhaps that's a history erasure, but a lot of those stories never would have survived. Now scale it up to something that might be occurring in 2024. This goes through cities across the entire planet, and then it solidifies. What are you going to do? Population will have collapsed. Technology would have collapsed. And are you really going to dig this out, or are you just going to cut a new hole in that building and start using the second and third floors, which would now be your first and second floor? Because here's one of the most interesting things. In the lithographs of the day from, say, 1700 up to 1830, before photography, there's an enormous amount of information that you can glean from lithographs across the planet. This is up in Quebec. This is the Palais des Indentants. And you can't tell me that that bulge of earth in the middle there is just left there during construction, that they wouldn't have flattened that, where you see the people and it suddenly rises up. That should have been moved, but perhaps it was just too much trouble at the time. Buildings are still functional, and we see the same thing in the College of the Jesuits. Seemingly earth pushed up into the foundations and along the first floors there. And you see this again and again. If you start to notice the pattern, and even a more modern era photo here, 1923, this needed emergency reconstruction because it was flooded and there was a fire. But notice in the back how deep the windows are compared to the front. I mean, it's only a few feet. Do you think constructing that you would have just buried the front of the building and left the back intact like that? Because these mud volcanoes are common around the planet. Here's one in Tanzania. It's still active. It's gurgling from the top. Not so much pressure behind it, but imagine if this turned into a VEI 6 mud eruption. To keep into consideration, there's 3 times more water in the Earth's crust than there is on all the oceans, rivers, and lakes combined on our surface. 3 times as much water. So how much liquefaction and water mixed with earth constituents could that create, crack out, and bubble up from the surface in many places? Parking lot in the background, and you can see the scale that mud can start to reach in our modern era, what we consider large, is so minuscule throughout history of what has happened with the cataclysmic changes on this planet. Instead of doubling the scale of this or tripling the scale of it, why don't we go a scale of about 1 million times larger than this? And this is what would have pervaded the planet to start to get this kind of destruction across every era of history that we see. There's not one era from, say, 4,000 years prior until now where we don't see everything buried. And we're told that it was always a volcanic eruption or people just abandoned everything. People abandoning everything doesn't explain 12 feet of buried megaliths and previous societies to the apex of their engineering. There was something far more going on, and we see this again and again. Now, if this in Greece or Italy, volcanic eruptions are explained, great. But Rapa Nui and Easter Island, they say that the amount of new soil creation is something like 1/10 of an inch per year. So if you go back and do the math on this, this is far out of history, but they're saying these things are less than 2,000 years old. So there's a disconnect in history. And what do we see again? Buried. So if this mud was oozing from the top of that volcano and started pouring down the hill slowly, or it was more liquefied and went down the hill quickly, you would get exactly this berry profile here. Especially if it was something like this. Now put statues all through there, and what kind of coverage would you get? You would have the same exact heads sticking out, bodies contorted, bodies buried, and that explains Easter Island. And then we jump over into Central America here. Classic story is Mayans abandoned their temples around 1,000 years ago, and the jungle took over. Okay, well, jungle taking over doesn't explain all of this earth pushed against these massive temples. And again, it comes back to the lithographs. These are from the 1810s, 1820s, and it was the first exploration of the Yucatan. It's off the British Library here. Great collection. I linked it below. There's about 50 of these different photos here. And once you start to notice that it seems there's been earth pushed against these buildings and temples, then it starts to make sense. These things, that's not earth encroachment But in later renditions, what they appeared to do was sort of cover up this earth covering into plants are there. Look how smooth it is in the background. Oh, that's just plants growing. And it doesn't appear as if it was so covered. And these are the later renditions in the 1880s. So what was the huge disconnect here between earth covering and now it's just gingerly rainforest covered? Because that was the explanation, was rainforest just enveloped everything. But those previous photos, that was not rainforest covering anything. Did you see it? And the explorer right down there trying to get in the completely earth-buried tunnels. And if you look to the right of that, you can see which direction the earth would have flowed from. You can see it coming over the gateway of Larna. And wherever you look in the Mayan kingdom, massive amounts of earth coming through entrances, burying things. This was one of my favorites because they clearly show you the earth packing inside what would have been an empty residence chamber, because that earth was not part of the original construction. So 3 things will happen during this global liquefaction event. First, we're going to get an enormous amount more volcanoes going off. Now, right now they're dust and ash, but what if those turn to mud? And what if you had mud and water and really thick substance blowing out at least a couple thousand feet high? How long would that take before that liquefied earth would start moving and covering everything? Out in the middle of an Indonesian island, it would for sure cover the temples. What would it do inside a modern city? Let me look over in Pakistan, one of the cradles of civilizations. So when historians say they can't really find a lot of ruins that were talked about in the old stories going back 6,000 years, perhaps they're still there, but they're buried because these mud volcanoes are significantly large throughout Pakistan and Afghanistan. And then proof to concept here in Maharashtra in India, this was completely buried, caked in earth. And somebody stumbled across this after, I guess, a storm and noticed that there was a small piece of rock sticking out. And the more they dug, the more they found. This was completely buried in earth. Some kind of massive cataclysm had rolled in and sealed this off. Mud. And if we jump over to Turkey here, they call it the Stargate of Midas. Incredible work, and we see a lot of these around the planet as well. Just edifices cut into straight limestone or sandstone cliffs that create their own entrance. You're supposed to put your head against this, use a vibration of Om or some other types of Sa or Va, and the vibration in conjunction with the stone is supposed to take you to reach divinity. Now for me, another thing that makes no sense on this, they had the ability to carve from the entire top of that stone face all the way to the bottom. Such beautiful work. Look at the incredible stonemanship on this. But at the very bottom, they forgot to carve the rest and make it flat. Or it was carved to perfection and something oozed out of the top of that mountain and then covered that up, and the people of the day either didn't have the tech at the time to recarve that, or they didn't have the resources, manpower, and then today we just leave it as it is. So what caused them not to finish it? I think it was finished and then recovered. And these signs are around us everywhere you look. In the history that we've been told of these ant-like figures, we're able to create thousands and thousands of these buildings, and that's just the way they built. And then they stopped, and we can't even repair these buildings today because it costs too much or the artisans aren't there. We forgot how to do stonework, and there's a million excuses why these things can't be built again or repaired. That seems to be a running theme through history as well. That somehow in the Middle East, all these giant megaliths were constructed with the most ornate stone craftsmanship, and somehow it's just left to go to crumbling ruins because nobody can repair it. It's such out of the scale of our human scope to even move stones like this, let alone repair them and construct new ones from solid pieces. And you ever notice they're all solid pieces when they're construction, but when we try to repair it today, it's always little tiny ton blocks that need to be concreted together. And look at some of the Ottoman Empire lithographs from the 1830s. A few of these cathedrals and large halls seem a bit out of place and a bit more than construction, because in the back there you can see it continues and continues and continues in the next set of halls. And if you want modern examples, all we have to do is take a look at Pennsylvania Station, one of the largest structures ever built in the United States up to that point, and the most unimaginable craftsmanship. Yet it had to be demolished. Just wasn't good enough. Public Register, they'll put wooden houses on there. Oh, save the wooden house. It's from the 1870s. But something like this, oh no, it's not good enough. Just tear it down. Save the wooden house. Tear down the marble structures. because we're told this is the way they constructed everything in the day. And then out in Seattle, this is the best they could do, a bunch of stilts and mud streets in 1911, and that's the best they could do. But what happened to all that's the way they built everything? And you would look at some of these images. Okay, this was taken in 1909, the photo, but 1830 was the construction date on this. This is where the Paris Air Show was held in 1909. Introduction of helium and hydrogen balloons. But notice the giant size, again, that has been put forth as construction of the day. That's just the way they did it. Because over in England, too, we see the exhibition 1851. This is built in 1830, the Crystal Palace. These corridors within, how much glass would that have taken? And the clarity of the crystal and the glass on this as well. They would have used the entire world's supply for 4 or 5 years just to build this one structure here and bringing it into a colored rendition from the Telegraph. This was built in 1830, supposedly. But again, we get all these out-of-place artifacts and, oh, it was destroyed by fire and they had to tear it all the way down. They couldn't repair it. They had to destroy it completely. And this is the repeating theme in history here. These giant things that were supposedly, that's the way they built it, are and were being completely destroyed down to, and then let's just rebuild a square thing that makes no sense and not even remotely close to what this would be. If it was such a common thing and so easy to do in the 1830s when there were no modern construction cranes and, basic rudimentary factories, I mean, should we not be able to create the same again, especially today, 150 years later? I guess not. So something significant's happening on these resets here. You see it across the planet. You see it through tech. You see it through story. You see it through every chapter of history. Things are buried. Society resets. Starts anew on top of the old layers. Continues forward with the stories of how the old societies were and explain away some of the larger things that make no sense for the construction of the day. And I think the celestial map of the universe explains it best. A time clock of the magnetic north or equatorial ecliptic on this map here. Each of the planets, and they show Jupiter and Saturn there very clearly, would be pointing toward or away from. And once these arrows all culminated and started pointing in the same direction, you knew that it was time for something significant to happen. I think this was a clock to measure the magnetism of the planets and how they were interacting with each other. A compass map in a different fashion. A celestial map of compass and magnetism and earth effects. I think that's why the ancients were so focused on the stars and so focused on the planets and the sun. They knew they had profound effects on our earth and our society. But today, we don't even look at the stars. How many people out of the total on the planet went outside to watch the Great Conjunction if they had clear skies? A once in an 800-year event with Jupiter and Saturn, the closest they hadn't been since 1226 AD. Of a total percentage of the population with clear skies that night, what percent do you think actually went outside and viewed that? The lack of understanding and the disinterest in cycles, our solar system, our sun, and the universe, and the workings and interconnectedness between it all and the cycles of civilization has been completely written out of our history books and our classrooms. You have to take it upon yourself to become interested in this, because if the general populace knew these cycles, there'd be no way to control them. And we're coming into another cycle right now, and it's quite interesting. The reset is here. Maybe this is the reset they're not talking about, and Klaus Schwab is distracting you with the economic reset when this is, in fact, the real reset. The real new world they're talking about, the real new world they're referencing that we're entering. Because if a global liquefaction event happens again, we will absolutely enter a new world. And I am trying to put more information like this together over my Patreon channel, /Adapt2030, economics, cryptocurrency, ancient history, and where we're moving in the next 5 years. Thanks for watching. Hope you got something out of the video, and I'll see you next time.